There is a moment that most people never recognize. A moment that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with excitement. It does not feel like progress. And it certainly does not look like transformation. In fact, it often feels like the opposite, like nothing is happening, like everything has slowed down, like the momentum that once existed has quietly disappeared. And in that silence, something unusual begins to emerge. A pause. Not just in your actions, but in your internal reactions. A subtle interruption in the patterns that once felt automatic. At first, this pause can feel uncomfortable because the mind is used to movement. To reacting. To interpreting everything instantly. To maintaining a constant flow of thoughts, emotions, and responses. And when that flow begins to slow down, the mind assumes something is wrong. It tries to fix the silence. It tries to recreate the familiar patterns. It searches for something to react to, something to hold on to. But what if this silence is not a problem? What if this is the exact moment where something deeper is reorganizing? Because before reality changes externally, it begins to reorganize internally, and that reorganization does not happen through force. It happens through interruption. Interruption of automatic reactions. Interruption of unconscious patterns. The interruption of identity, being repeated without awareness. Most people never reach this moment because they fill the silence too quickly. They return to distraction. They return to reaction. They return to the familiar version of themselves. But if you remain in that pause, if you allow the silence to exist without trying to escape it, you begin to notice something. You are still there, but the patterns are not. And for the first time, you are not reacting from them. Most people believe their actions define their reality, but actions are only the surface. What truly shapes reality is what happens before the action. The reaction, the interpretation, the immediate emotional response that arises without conscious choice. Every time something happens, the mind reacts, and that reaction feels natural. Automatic. Almost inevitable. But what most people do not realize is that reaction is not neutral. It carries identity. It reinforces patterns. Confirms beliefs that were already present. And over time, those repeated reactions become a structure that defines how you see the world. How you interpret situations, how you respond to opportunities, and how you experience reality itself. Reaction creates continuity. It keeps the same version of you active, even when you believe you are trying to change. You may change your environment. You may change your goals. You may even change your actions. But if your reactions remain the same, the outcome will eventually return to the familiar. This is why so many people feel stuck, not because they are not trying, but because they are reacting from the same internal pattern, the same identity, the same interpretation of reality. But awareness introduces something new. It introduces a gap, small space between the trigger and the reaction. And in that space, there is freedom. Freedom not to suppress, not to force a different response. But simply to observe. And when you observe without reacting, you stop reinforcing the pattern. You stop feeding the identity that depends on that reaction. And slowly, that identity begins to lose its structure. At first, the shift is almost invisible. Nothing dramatic changes on the outside. Your environment remains the same. The people around you behave the same way. The situations that once triggered you still appear, but internally, something is no longer the same. There is a distance now, a subtle separation between you and the patterns you used to embody. You begin to notice thoughts without immediately believing them. You begin to feel emotions without being consumed by them. You begin to experience situations without reacting in the same way, and this changes everything. Because perception is not passive. Perception is active. It selects. It filters. It interprets. It assigns meaning, and meaning shapes experience. 2. People can live in the same reality and experience completely different worlds, not because reality changed, but because perception did. And when perception changes, reality begins to reorganize around it. This is where most people get confused. They expect transformation to be external first. They wait for something in their life to change so they can feel different. But the process works in reverse. You begin to feel different because you are no longer perceiving reality in the same way. You are no longer reinforcing the same interpretations, the same assumptions, the same emotional patterns. And as those patterns lose strength, new possibilities begin to appear. Possibilities that were always there, but were never perceived, because perception was limited by identity. But now, that identity is no longer fully in control. And with that, reality begins to expand. And as this expansion continues, you begin to notice something even deeper, that the mind no longer feels the same urgency to interpret everything. Situations arise, but they do not immediately demand a conclusion. Experiences unfold, but they do not instantly become a story. There is space. And in that space, clarity begins to emerge. You start to see how much of your previous reality was built not from facts, but from interpretations repeated so often that they felt absolute. You begin to recognize patterns that once felt invisible. You see how quickly the mind used to label situations. How quickly it decided what something meant. And how those meanings shaped your emotional state. But now, that automatic process is no longer as strong. There is awareness present, and awareness slows everything down. Not in a way that limits you, but in a way that allows you to see more. To perceive more. To understand more. And when perception expands, possibility expands with it. Because reality is no longer being filtered through the same narrow lens. It is being observed with a different level of consciousness. And that changes everything. As this shift continues, something becomes undeniable. Your experience of reality begins to change, not in a sudden, dramatic way, but in a subtle, consistent, almost unnoticeable progression. Situations that once felt overwhelming no longer carry the same weight. Conversations that once triggered emotional reactions feel neutral. Decisions that once felt difficult become clear, and opportunities that once seemed invisible start to appear naturally. This is not coincidence. This is alignment. Alignment between perception and possibility. Because when you stop reacting from the old identity, reality no longer has the same structure to maintain. The patterns begin to dissolve. The loops begin to break. The repetition begins to fade. And in that space, something new emerges. Not something forced, not something created through effort, but something revealed. A different way of experiencing life. A different way of interacting with reality. A different version of yourself that was always possible, but never accessed because the old identity was constantly being reinforced. Now, that reinforcement has stopped, and without reinforcement, the old reality cannot sustain itself. This is the moment where reality begins to follow, not because you control it, but because you are no longer unconsciously repeating it. The shift was never about changing the world. It was about changing the way you participate in it. And once that changes, everything else begins to follow. And as this process deepens, you begin to trust something that most people overlook. You begin to trust the absence of reaction. You begin to trust the space between thoughts. You begin to trust the stillness that once felt uncomfortable. Because within that stillness, there is no pressure to become something. There is no need to force change. There is only awareness. And that awareness allows reality to unfold differently. Not because you are trying to control it, but because you are no longer distorting it through unconscious patterns. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, life begins to reflect that shift, not as a dramatic transformation, but as a quiet evolution. One that continues to deepen over time, one that becomes more stable, more natural, more aligned. Until eventually, the way you experience reality feels completely different, not because the world changed first, but because you did. And in that change, reality simply followed.